Hello and welcome to another episode of my Datsun 280Z project car build. I'm Dave, this is Grindhouse Performance Engineering, and in today's episode, I've got some pretty crazy ideas for the fuel system for this car, and we're gonna see if we can pull them off. Stay tuned. So I don't know about you guys, but after the last couple episodes, getting the headers fully fabricated and going through and building the complete exhaust for the car, all I want to do is hear this car run, and I want to hear it real bad. So the last week, I went through the catalog, and I went through everything that I thought I would need to be able to get the car running, and I got it on order. So everything to finish out the fuel system, everything to finish out the cooling system, the intake, the wiring, almost all of it is completely on order, with the exception of the wiring. I'm still working on the design for that, and I don't know exactly all the connectors and stuff that I need. So some of those supplies I haven't ordered yet, but we're getting close. So for today's episode though, I want to go ahead and I want to get started mounting the actual fuel system and the fuel cell to the car. Right now it's just kind of sitting in a hole. There's just a hole in the floor and it's not mounted to anything, so it's loose, but we needed it in position when we actually built the exhaust because we want to make sure we had plenty of clearance. So today's episode, I'm going to be actually building the structure back here that's going to rigidly mount the fuel cell, and then I'm also going to be mounting the fuel filter, and then I'm going to be doing some crash protection for the rear, because right now you can see the fuel cell is completely exposed in the rear and it looks really cool, but it's also pretty dangerous. So we're going to be building some tubular structure down there as well to actually protect the fuel cell in case we get into an accident. We have an extra layer of protection for the fuel cell. All right, well, that's enough talking. Let's get to fabricating. The rear structure will serve a number of different purposes. I want to have some crash protection for the rear, a solid mount for the fuel cell, tow points to strap the car down, and a rear jacking point I can actually get to since the differential is really difficult to access at ride height. The first thing I'm building today are tow hooks that are going to be welded to the bottom of the structure. These will provide solid points for strapping the car down or pulling it out of the weeds if I go off-roading at the track. I'm using 1/4-inch steel plate, and these will be welded directly to the bottom of the cage surrounding the fuel cell. Each of the plates are first center punched, drilled, and cleaned up before moving over to the bandsaw. By drilling all the holes first, I can move my cut lines in the saw in case the holes weren't exactly centered. Drilling by hand is never all that easy, and so this helps me make sure that the finished part still looks right. For something that would have taken 30 seconds in a CNC, these took quite a while to build by hand. I wanted the parts to look as identical as possible since they'll be completely visible in the rear of the car. Regardless, I'm still really happy how these plates turned out building them by hand. With the toe plates built, I'm moving on to the main structure to mount the fuel cell. The structure will be constructed in two main pieces. The upper structure will be constructed of rectangular tubing that will be welded directly to the frame rails, and the lower structure will be constructed of round tubing that will be bolted to the upper frame. The lower structure is going to be completely visible with the way the rear bumper is cut out of the car, so it's really important to me that this looks awesome. factory frame rail is tapered in the front, so I'm notching the rectangular tubing to clamp it down and taper it to align correctly with the frame rail. After cutting and welding the taper, I'm going to go ahead and grind those welds down as well so the tubing looks seamless. This doesn't need to be exact, but the end result will look much more professional by having taken this extra step. The rest of the upper frame is cut pretty quickly on the horizontal bandsaw. I've intentionally cut the corners of the frame at an angle to give more of a crumple zone for any impact that isn't directly in the rear. I'm also adding some reliefs to the area to serve as a dedicated failure point and increase the accessibility to the exhaust hangers. Everything for the upper frame is cut now, and I'm actually really happy with how everything turned out. It fits really well. I intentionally left a gap on everything of 1/16 inch because I'm going to shim the frame around the fuel cell to give it a little bit of wiggle room, especially after welding. It might move a little bit. So if I took the frame and I crunched it up against the sides of the fuel cell, there's a chance that I might not be able to pull it out or install it again because of the bumps in the welding in the corners of the fuel cell and what I'm going to weld. It might move it around. So I'm giving it a little bit of a gap on all sides just so it has a little bit of wiggle room, and that'll be just fine. But otherwise, everything fits really well. The cutouts for the exhaust bolts look really good. I'm really happy with that. Everything fits really well. The taper here, to follow the taper of the frame rail, looks pretty much spot on. One thing I did want to mention, so this was pretty straightforward, just cutting rectangular tubing with the horizontal bandsaw. There wasn't a whole lot to it. But these rectangular tubes, if you see this line here, this is actually a weld seam. And on the inside of the tube, there's actually a bump from that welding. It's smooth on the outside, well, you can feel a little bit of a divot, but on the inside, it actually does leave a bump. So I was very intentional to make sure that that weld seam was not on any of the lines where I'm gonna be putting a riv nut in, because if you think about drilling a hole through that weld seam, one, drilling through the weld is gonna make it a little bit harder, and then two, trying to actually put a riv nut and compress it and have it lay flat against that weld seam isn't going to be possible. So I made a conscious effort to make sure that the weld seam was nowhere near where I knew I was going to be putting hardware. And then past that, you'll see for the back bar here, the weld seam actually lines up all the way around. So once it's painted, you might not tell that, but you might actually see a divot that's going to follow that whole section. So that's kind of neat. So just a little trick. Now that this is all cut, I'm going to pull everything out, tape everything up, start welding it together, and I think I can build the rest of the structure completely off the car if I take good notes. The fuel cell for the car is actually pretty special. Inside of the aluminum shell is a thick plastic fuel tank filled with foam and a Radium Engineering surge tank system. The surge tank means that regardless of the fuel sloshing around the tank, there will always be a chamber full of fuel to feed the engine. To mount the fuel cell to the upper frame, I'm drilling an unbelievable amount of holes that will have riv nuts installed into. Each of the holes are center punched, pilot drilled, and then drilled to the correct diameter before being cleaned up with the Dremel and then riv nut into place. This is tedious and time-consuming work, but it's important that each of the riv nuts are in the right place so that each of these 20-something bolts can bolt to the fuel cell properly. It's important to deburr any of the holes before installing riv nuts since they're compressed against the inside of the tubing when they're installed. So the rear frame is all welded up. The cell is completely bolted to the frame now. That was a lot of holes. That was a lot of holes and a lot of riv nutting. So I did have to break out the Dremel a little just to help some of the holes out that weren't quite 100% aligned, but you know, give me a break. It's a lot of riv nuts and it's a lot of aligning and a lot of drilling by hand that just is never gonna turn out great. So overall, really happy though. Bolted in place, nice and strong, nice and sturdy. So now we're gonna break out the tube bender and we're actually gonna do a whole lower section of frame that's gonna be completely visible on the car. So this is gonna be cool. Let's do it. The lower tubing is constructed of 1 3/4 120 wall DOM tubing and a pair of Schedule 40 cast steel bends. I'm using the Schedule 40 on the corners because of how large the bend radius would be around the rear of the cell if I used a regular tube bender. The area I'm working in is really tight, so this helps me put the tubes exactly where I need them. When using a tube bender, there's a couple of important things to keep in mind. The first is that bending stretches the metal, meaning if you start with a 24-inch straight tube, by the time you bend it, the overall tube will be longer than what you started with. It's also important to realize that the point you start your bend will most likely not actually be where the bend starts. Bending a test piece that's been carefully marked beforehand will help you see these differences to make adjustments in your future bends. It's always really a good idea to do a test piece that's been carefully marked before you start bending big pieces that are really important. The joints welded to the Schedule 40 pipe are being ground smooth, so when it's powder coated, the tube will appear to be one seamless piece under the car. This should look really good once it's been coated. All right, so I've got the verticals welded in now, and I've got the V finished, and I couldn't be happier with how things turned out. I feel like I'm saying that a lot, but I'm honestly surprising myself every time because I've never made anything like this before. And so to have this turn out the way it did, I'm really proud of it, and I'm really happy. The V in the center was actually funny. I know you probably didn't see me actually bend it. That's because I didn't record it. That's because I didn't think what I tried was gonna work. I don't have a 1-inch die for my tube bender. I only have the 1 3/4 and 1.5 inches. And so I just kind of threw the 1-inch pipe or the 1-inch tube into the bender and bent it, hoping that, I'm only making one bend, and if it's not perfect, that's okay. But honestly, it looks really good. I'm really happy with it. So I notched it and I notched the bottom here too, so it sit nice on the tube, and it turned out awesome. I'm really surprised that it worked out. I really am. I didn't think that would. But yeah, everything is really in good shape now. I still have to I'm gonna make some plates here that are gonna weld to the tubes here so that we can actually bolt this to the rectangular tubing. I don't want this to be one welded structure. That's gonna be a little bit silly. So I want this bottom piece to be completely removable. But I think we're gonna save that for the next episode. I've gotta cut the floor out of the car too, and I just have a lot of stuff to do to actually get this into the car. So I think we're gonna call this one here. I really did want to thank you guys again for watching. This is a really small channel, and to have the responses that we've had from people already has been incredible to me. So thank you for that. We've got a lot of exciting stuff coming for the LS swap. We're going to be talking through how we're actually going to do the fuel system, how we're doing the crankcase ventilation, the intake, cooling, all that stuff. We're going to go into a lot of detail on. So if you know someone who's doing an LS swap and you want to get them involved in this, definitely share this series with them, because it's going to get really cool. We're going to be doing all the wiring. We're going to be doing everything on this car. So thank you, and I will see you in the next episode.